Is everyone happy with this Christian interpretation of Carnival? If I might offer a comment, I have a contemporary 17th century description of Carnival which seems to fit this interpretation very well. It's described as a feast of 8 days, accompanied with all manner of singing, skipping and dancing and jollity, in which time a perfect lampooning liberty is allowed, and scandal so highly exalted they may freely sing all the faults, villainies and frauds of their superiors. And the only way to stop their mouth is to ply them lustily with drink. The only trouble is that comes from a Dutch account of the coast of Guinea. And there is at least a superficial level in which the phenomenon of Carnival is worldwide, and I wondered how you related this rather localized interpretation. We did, after all, see films of the Christian culture.
Well, I don't. I noticed that in the Indian case that we read, that there did seem to be the same kind of annual accumulation of offences which were being somehow brought up and somehow expiated or dealt with. I don't think really that I have anything to say too ignorant to accept that perhaps all religious rituals being roughly about the same thing will tend to produce roughly the same effects. But
well, I think this is what makes some of the discussion about a general sense, and one has it very much, I think, when one is trying to analyze the relationship between Islamic and pagan rituals in Africa or anywhere else, that these things are about the same kind of things. I think it's very difficult to see confession, for example, as moving from the church into the village or the town, when we know that confession has moved, as it were, from the village into the church in the first place. That is to say, and so it's mock only in a certain sense. It may be mocking something which, in a sense, is already there in the Charivari or in some other modes of this kind, where people are being forced, in a sense, to confess their sins, or else thinking that they can expiate, thinking if they do it voluntarily, they're in some case expiating the sin. I mean, one finds this, for example, in aspects of witchcraft, where people are sort of confessing to things which are enormously improbable there, on the grounds that by speaking this out, they're somehow getting rid of it. So that the idea that confession is expiatory in this way, I mean, isn't simply coming, as it were, from the church. It's also perhaps coming out of the way and being formalized. And if I think, again, that somebody was talking earlier about the question of some aspects of Carnival sort of coming from the elite downwards, this again has been a sort of persistent discussion in folkloristic and other rituals. But certainly, I mean, if certain forms of masks come downwards, the mask also went upwards. I mean, it was formalized in art culture, if you like, and then came back again. I mean, take Julian's examples of phony folk, which he has discussed at different times. I mean, you get the sort of steel en pierre bed in the peasant's house, but the steel en pierre bed is itself a sort of formalization of something that was there. Something that was there before. I mean, it's a sort of dialectical process, which makes, I think, it very difficult to, perceive it as coming, perceive anything like this in its totality, anyhow, as coming either from earlier elements, or from later, earlier Celtic elements, or from later ritual ones. These things seem to me to be sort of amalgams at a particular which do have a great tendency to persist simply because they are formalistic in their production. A lot of people are involved in them, and because they're formalistic, it means that they're very susceptible to change of persistence and form and change of meaning. I think this is why some of the problems of interpretation are so problematical, because masks, disguises sort of continue over, persist and persist and persist, and yet they have very different meanings at different times.
I'm a bit, I have great sympathy for Mr. Boss's position. And I don't see that one gets anywhere by avoiding the fact that this is a Christian ritual. In order to put it, there are analytics, presumably, that one wants to develop to see it in relation to others, but each step you take away from the theological context, which gives it its central symbolism and the central meaning, to the active. Many of the things that we're laying onto the carnival are things that are in our heads. They're in our heads, not necessarily in the heads there. But again, I think part of the elegance of Peter's presentation was his capacity to move from what was a native interpretation in the 14th, 15th century to other kinds of interpretation. I mean, so that I think a Dutchman seeing something on the coast of Guinea in the 17th century he's telling us about what he sees. We don't know anything about what those people in Guinea are doing. But even in a system in which these markers and all of these things are very, very meaningful to people, that seems to me, I agree totally with you, is where you start in understanding it. Whatever else we bring to it is, I won't say it's extra, but that's another activity.
May I say just two things? One, that I think the contrast with Lent is the fundamental fact, it would seem to me. And two, I am interested in the dating, and if the linguistic evidence is right, this does not go back before the 11th and 12th century. I think it's extremely interesting and would support my view.
Yes, it was a good convention, derived from the Saturnalia, wasn't it, by Protestant Levitists, whom the Romans
realize that. It seems to me the dating of the word made it rather difficult to support, since there seems to be no use of the word before the 11th century.
What else is the shift in the confessional related to? Or I wasn't quite clear in your statement whether this is something which is autonomous in relation to the theological system, or whether it indeed comes with a series of other changes which are going on.
Well, the development of private confession goes with the development of scholastic theology in the 12th century.
Does this mean the growth of a more educated laity? The greater individualism, individuality is getting more complicated for some people, therefore there's a demand for individual confession. And this being so, sort of the social function of confession would be left free-floating, as it were, and might take that's what you mean, isn't it? It might mean take the form of a
yes, I feel it is
ritual.
Being left free-floating, yes, that is really much what I was trying to say. Otherwise, I feel I'm not sufficiently an early medieval historian to interpret clearly, except that I am clear on the shift from public to private and the shift from the beginning of Lent to the end of Lent.
And you think that this was imposed on the society by the theologians and the
private confession, yes, I would have thought so, yes.
Just to say, I think we are taking a bend towards particularist interpretations, that is, to try and locate these in specific theological context belonging to Christendom, and thereby sort of whittling down the suggestion that comes from Keith's counterexample. I have a feeling that we have to operate at both levels. We have to certainly seek the particularist explanation in the context of the given society, the given set of beliefs in terms of theology or other forms of ideology. But at the same time, I think it is useful to emphasize again and again the universalistic aspects of rituals. Because if we do not do that, some of the universalistic constructs, like ritual as rebellion, ritual as forms of protest, ritual as inversion of social relationships, which have been studied from Gluckman's area to Radcliffe Brown's area. All those suggestions are relatively weakened. Therefore, I feel that I should like to emphasize the universalistic aspect of rituals. Of these, taking what you have said and Peter have said, I find 5 aspects. One is the element of vow, element of penance. The earliest reference in Sanskrit texts about an Indian festival goes to a text that was written around 200 AD, and that describes festivals as arising from a pledge on the part of the devotee not to do one thing or the other. It was definitely a negative sort of thing. And then, as medievalist sort of commentators filed in one after the other, you see, over the centuries, this was all turned into positive injunctions and so on and so forth. So we find throughout the whole range of Indian festivals, particularly the brothas, which are called brothas in Sanskrit, and also in vernacular languages today, this element of self-deprivation, either in the form of fasting or in the form of making a sacrifice or in the form of making a gift, that you deprive yourself. In fact, they say the word in Sanskrit is tapas. Tapas means penance, means undertaking something that gives you pain. So I think that element is common. The other elements which are common, and just refer to Peter's intervention in his paper, are 4, as well as Professor Peter Rivers have said. I'll take together with 4 others. One is more or less in this order: obscenity. Second, the element of pageant and procession. Third, the element of mock battle. And fourth, the element of sacrifice. I'm not ranked this last point, penance, but I have a feeling that one can sort of try and suggest that in most cultures there will be more or less invariably an element of obscenity connected with this carnival type, an element of coming next to it, element of procession and display, public display, and so on and so forth. Why I want to emphasize this? Because one of the things is that I am interested in looking at rituals as language. And as we all know, structural linguistics has done a lot of very inspired research, influenced by Roman Jacobson, in search of universals. Jacobson and his disciples have established that there is no language in the world, for instance, which does not have a syllable that starts with a consonant. And there is no language in the world which does not have a syllable that doesn't end with a consonant. And then on grammatical level, they have a construct about syntactic structures, about the, as a function of the relationship of the subject, the verbal predicate and object. Now, some of these universals have proved to be wrong. They are not universals, but on the whole, starting with Jacobson's work through Greenberg up to the work of the Prague structuralists, now we can say that it is scientifically demonstrated that the languages of the world do contain certain universals. I think that a powerful language like that of rituals, particularly rituals of the order that we've discussed, carnivals, do have certain universals. And I would suggest that these five, vow and penance, mock battle, obscenity, sacrifice, and pageants, these five merit consideration. Maybe some of them will have to be modified.
Well, that's an ambitious scheme.
So we seem to be coming close here to two at least of the possible ways of interaction of history and anthropology. One is to use historical data equally with contemporary ethnographic data to arrive at your universals, sort of modified Levi-Straussian way of doing history. The other is to try to use anthropological insights to illuminate the specifics of a particular period of time when it's much less useful to say that what one is looking at in Carnival in Spain is a manifestation of universal structures, I think. Or at least the more successful you are at unlaying the universal structures, the less interesting it becomes each time to discover them, if you see what I mean. I think the dispute, insofar as it is a dispute between Jack Goody and John Bossy, is not so much about the question of the atmosphere of these things by the time you reach the 16th century, because what Jack was saying perfectly readily admits that by this time they're in a Christian context and gain significance through Christian theology. It's largely a question of whether or not you're going to press hard on your notion of the origin of these things. And since at the moment, so far as I understand it, our data on that must be purely speculative.
Well,
it seems more
linguistic at the moment out of the dictionary.
Yes, and that's not very good data, is it? Because the dictionary record is presumably the first time they've discovered this word in use in a print context or in a manuscript context. But in any case, it seems more sensible to concentrate upon what Jack was suggesting there, the various ways in which these common elements can be integrated, and you rightly pointed out that they are very effectively integrated in an overall manner into the pattern of the Christian interpretation. I would like to say two further things. One is that Professor Cohen says that this is what gives them meaning. I would agree that this is what gives them an overall meaning, but I'd like to revert to the point I made this morning, that within that overall meaning there are a multiplicity of smaller meanings, and we haven't got nearly as far as we need to go merely by saying that this is the meaning of Carnival. The second is I'd like to express a rather Philistine unhappiness about your block of sacred time. It seems a hell of a big block. You say things that happen in sacred time are different from things that don't. We've got 6 months of the year for your block of sacred time. It begins...
I would have extended it to All Saints too.
Well, quite so. That's the other point about it. Is that really the effective block of sacred time? And you've got to run into Christmas, haven't you, as well as a run out of it. I really don't find that very persuasive, I must say.
Yes, well, I couldn't really elaborate on this in any detail, but I willingly admit that I'm extrapolating very much from what I see as happening in England. But I think it's perfectly possible to see the vast majority of high ritual activities actually occurring in this block of time. There is, in some places, a short run into Christmas, which may be the 21st of December. But Advent as a whole, in terms of ritual activities, doesn't seem to involve a great deal. But there does seem to be a connection between the number of church observances involving high ritual, popular holidays, periods of license, even, I think, a certain element of continuity in the symbolism which one can perceive in use at this time, which, when attached to the movable nature of Easter, the fact that it can be either early or late, so that when it is at its earliest, it can start 2 days after Candlemas, which is the last day of Christmas, and those 2 days, of course, are the Shrovetide days, and when it's at its latest, the Feast of Corpus Christi coincides with Midsummer Day. I think one can put forward quite a strong argument to suggest that that period of time has an unusual character. It's quite different in liturgical terms because it's concerned very much with the life story, death story of Christ, whereas after that you have a succession of Trinity Sundays and the rest, and a few scattered moments certainly, but there is no continuity, and nor do you find extended popular holidays in that second half of the year.
When you have 6 months of the year, as sacred time, which is the usual,
Well,
which is the unusual.
when I'm saying, I mean, one has to use sort of shorthand terms here. I'm not saying that when people are toiling away that they think they're in sacred time. I merely mean that when ritual actually occurs during this period of time, I suspect it has a different quality to what takes place at the other times of the year. It seems to be much more ritual activity in England.
But surely I'd like to know a precise definition of the question we are arguing. Is it being contested that there is a concept of sacred time as against non-sacred time or secular time, or is it being contested that the span that has just been suggested to be sacred time, 6 months or so a year, is too long or too short? Because I think we need to get this clear, because obviously this is very basic. What would you be?
It's the second I'm unhappy about.
That is
I don't want to be unhappy about the first at this particular moment.
Does the English period of sacred time quite fit into the Christian scheme? Because it finishes at midsummer, doesn't it?
Yes, but
St. John's Day.
yes,
mostly,
but as I say, by the time you've got the Feast of Corpus Christi, which is actually the climax of the Easter cycle, which is attached, it's the last feast attached to the notability of Easter. That, when Easter is at its latest, coincides with Midsummer Day, rather deliberately on this respect, I think.
How exactly does mumming fit into the English ritual scene? This seems to have many points of contact with carnival, and yet it isn't like it in many ways. I mean, mumming takes place at the turning points, the usual turning points at Epiphany and Shrovetide, Whitsun and Midsummer. It consists of disguised bands of people running through the streets in the City of London, for example, or sometimes running through churches, encircling the churches. Sometimes they wear bells, like those people we saw on the film. They don't insult the Virgin, but in the Reformation context, sometimes they interrupt the preacher. In the City of London, mumming takes a very interesting form, I think, because these disguised people break into the houses of the citizens. Very often the practice is forbidden for this reason. What they do is insist on playing dice with them. However, the dice is always loaded in favour of the mummers, so they always win. In other words, it's surely an inversionary rite. You've got the inversionary element present. Fortune favours the citizens, the rich normally, but on this particular occasion, the poor, and fortune is so sort of fixed, as it were, to favour the poor. And these bands, beyond this action of playing dice, the thing which it seems to me makes mumming different from a carnival always involves the people participating. They mingle with the general public, don't they? Am I right in that? What do you call them, the masked people and so on. In one way or another, they have relations with the spectators and so on. So the carnival is in some ways a rite of solidarity. But English mummers, they never say anything, they never mingle, they just come and they go. So that when, for example, mumming becomes a court rite, the disguising, this still continues to be an aspect of it. And lords come in, they dance, they go out again, and that's the rite. So that it's an other world breaking in on the ordinary world in some kind of way. But on the other hand, this doesn't seem to be at all Christian, does it?
And it happens to be rather nice at the key points of my block of sacred time, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think that comes back to a point that I was making earlier, that in England I don't think one could wish to generalise from single customs, which might survive or be mentioned, to the wider observance of Carnival. It seems to me we are faced with the problem here, the areas of Europe where Carnival doesn't seem to have been practised. I don't know where one draws the line, to be quite honest, but that seems to be certainly the one in Scandinavia, I think.
You mentioned there that it was largely in southern countries, rather than northern ones.
Feeling I have.
I had a feeling that you were connecting this with some sort of Ur Celtic tradition,
Oh, no.
rather than the fact that it's damn cold to be out of doors that Shrove Tuesday.
Well, it's cold
morning.
in that
They're in the snow.
What?
They're in the
Oh, you-
snow.
Well, it's obviously an inhibitory factor. I mean, the fact that you get a lot of performances tending to be moved. I mean, for instance, Easter plays were moved to Corpus Christi, weren't they, at one stage? It tended to be moved to Corpus Christi. I mean, a tendency to move things to the warmer months was. Didn't this happen at one stage? I thought this happened with miracle plays. They tended to earlier, weren't they, clustering around Easter, and then they tended to move to Corpus Christi later on.
This doesn't work so well with Scandinavia because the festival that carries the weight of Carnival is Christmas.
But is it on the streets?
Some of it is out indoors, but not all.
I mean, I think you see that what you're dealing with in Carnival, I mean, why the sort of mass participation, the business of opening up crevices and all this kind of thing, I mean, is that everything flows onto the streets at that time. I mean, even the life inside the house sort of flows outwards, and everything is taking place on the streets.
Well, I think this is a feeling one has of the descriptions of York, for example, with Hugh and his wife who go through the streets on horseback. And sort of proclamations made at the four gates of the city and all the rest of it. And the same sort of thing would apply in this one example, and I'd be able to find it open to correction if you've got some other ones, of Carnival, or rather this Shrovetide activity at Norwich. I mean, again, they are actually going through the streets.
Well, if you think Christmas mumming of Christmas things and so on, I mean, Christmas mumming, for the Irish, reports of Irish Christmas mumming, I mean, until recently, it happens around you now, isn't it? Well, there's a lot of Christmas mumming plays, and they actually are coming from outside into the kitchen and performing these plays in the kitchen there, just as they are in Newfoundland. I mean, the Christmas mumming there is actually coming into the house from outside and not flowing from the house out into the streets. And it's very much, in a sense, more private kind of thing than the mass performances that one gets with miracle plays, where you've got different guilds participating there, which the performance is on the street.
This is presumably related to something that Peter said about the withdrawal of the nobility in Italy into a kind of private carnival in the 18th century.
1718, yes. I thought
Probably
it
by a
was
large shift in the climatic cycle.
Well, I mean, there are all sorts of factors that are related to the calendrical, the clustering of calendrical rites, which is extremely important. I mean, one of them is a historical traditional fact. I mean, in most prophetic religions, the imprint of the life of the prophet is on the year. And there is bound to be some clustering. I mean, it's not randomly distributed throughout the year.
Yes, well, on the one hand, we have evidence from a film showing Carnival actually taking place in the snow. And second, we have evidence for activities which are out of doors, although they're not Carnival, at the similar times of the year. I think that really invalidates the point.
No, I was about to say that there were different factors in this, and one of them was the ecological, factor of clustering ceremonies at solstices and various times of this kind.
Well, I feel pretty sceptical of that.
Why is that ecological, Jack?
Well, I meant to do with astrological features. I mean, it was external to the. I mean, it's related to. I mean, part of it's related to the beginning and end of the productive year.
So it's striking when I looked at the Indian academic calendar, the Indian agricultural calendar is much easier to equate to the ritual cycle than it is in Europe. And it seems to me the European harvest cycle or the agricultural year doesn't really influence the ritual cycle as much. I mean, I think this comes back to Mr. Borty's point. I cannot get away from the fact that there's something else involved.
I thought that the Spanish films were over trying to make the point that this would be agricultural rights, and some were, but most weren't.
Would it interest just to be told that in Sanskrit language again, there are two distinct words. One, kala, which refers to time, It means time. And the other is Tithi. If I have to write it in English, I write T-I-T-H-I, which is sacred time. Kala is divided into equal bits, and these equal bits go up to almost the level of the second or even smaller fractions. That is, like the way we keep time now. But Tithi is unequal in length. Certain Tithis last longer than others, and you could really get into a terrible mess with the gods if you observed a particular brata, that is a festival based on a vow and penance, shorter and longer than the duration of the Tithi. Secondly, a very large corpus of medieval texts, Shastras, Smriti Shastras, exist precisely in defining Tithis, which Tithis last how long and what you should do when. Raghunandan's famous, the famous Bengali or Eastern Indian lawgiver of the 16th century, one of his major works is called Tithi Tattam, that is the theory of Tithis. The sort of big publishing business of Panjikas, we call it. It is ephemerides, is there a word? Yes. There's a sort of kind of literature about that. Every year, various organizations bring this out, and this is the purpose of this publication has been, ever since the British came, incidentally, to identify the Tithis and identify and prescribe the rites that should go with it. All I'm saying that in at least Indic culture, these two terms, time, let's say natural time, and sacred time, are clearly differentiated. It is also enshrined into the prescription that should be the ideal, according to the Shastras, that should be the ideal of the Brahman. The Brahman's daily routine, starting from bed up to going to bed again, including all kinds of separate ritual performances, which is given in all big Shastric texts, including the Code of Manu, is called Annik. The word Annik means, Anna means the day, and Annik means the ritual for the day, prescribed rituals for the day, for the twice born, but for the Brahmin. In other words, there is an attempt in this culture to differentiate natural time from ritual time, and ritual time again at two levels. One is public rituals, and that time is called Tithi. Another is the daily ritual, which is prescribed for a good Brahmin to live up to, and that is called Annik. And there are also books, a book by the same author, Raghunandan, is called Annika Tattva, Theory of Anniks.
I wonder if we might turn perhaps from the question of time to that of place. The great carnivals which Peter Burke described are all, of course, in large cities. Should we regard carnival as essentially an urban phenomenon?
I wanted to ask a question about that in terms of evidence. And given that they do seem to be in cities, and presumably, I don't know, one has more continuous evidence about the life of Rome, for example, than one does about the countryside in early medieval periods. What kind of evidence is there, does anybody know, about the continuity of civic life or civic ritual in the large cities of southern Europe during the period prior to that we're talking about? Or is there no evidence that one can draw upon? So if I were to extrapolate from my alien culture carnivals, which are Islamic, Swahili urban, there, once again, they seem to be very urban expressive, balancing one location of the town against another, very linked initially with patronage. You get again the withdrawal of the aristocracy, but initially they're very concerned, so it seems, with integrating people into loyalty associations which are not those of the commoners against the aristocracy, or not those on grounds of kin or ethnicity. And I would have been tempted, as one always is, to read one's own data into other. I would have been tempted to see something of this in the material that one's getting for Renaissance cities in southern Europe. I noticed that your full quotation from Goethe was interestingly worded. I think that he still said, didn't he, now the carnivals are provided for the people. Wasn't it something of the
No, but they're not something provided for the people, but something the people give themselves.
This is what's now happened. In the past, they...
No, he doesn't have a historical thesis. He just says this is how it is.
But I'm wondering really whether this whole aspect of the southern city with the patricians, with, in a sense, clientages, the economic aspect of carnival, who pays for it. You say that there doesn't seem to be a distribution of wealth, but I wonder whether there isn't an element of this. You tend to get it in other contexts other than the Swahili one. For example, the slave carnivals in Jamaica in the 18th century, where one set of slaves parades as Scots, the other set of slaves parades as English. And if one was to start to interpret this without knowing that their patrons and paymasters are Scots and English settlers, one would be taken rather far afield. So I'm wondering whether the carnival can't be set in the context of a particular kind of urban life, rather than, or additionally to, the context that we've been looking at.
Two comments. One, that there is evidence of a lot of people who don't live in towns coming into particular towns for carnival, notably Rome and Venice. In the case of Nuremberg, there are references to the local peasants coming in to watch proceedings. So in a sense, it looks as if the very flourishing of these urban carnivals would have drained possible rural competitors. As for who pays, the only accounts I've managed to consult are in Rome and for the 16th century, and show that the Pope was paying for the prizes for the races, but it was only costing him something like 500 scudi a year, which was chicken feed compared to his budget, so there was no redistribution. What I can't find much out about is who paid for the floats. A few 17th century floats of a particularly grand nature are said to have been paid for by Roman aristocrats. But again, I haven't got any figures as to what those floats would have set them back. And that everything would now turn on just how expensive it was to mount something like that, I think.
Isn't it true, though, that the floats were, in fact, very often an upper-class addition to carnival rituals? I mean, did the Medici start introducing floats with sort of classical context? Very often these floats are rather sophisticated things with allegorical significance and so on, and they could only have been put together by rather educated people.